Welcome to the latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Dr Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we are discussing the recent kinetic strike on an alleged drug vessel, which according to the New York Times may have been a migrant vessel, sinking it and killing 11 people on the high seas. Marco Rubio has been noted as saying that Trump ordered a strike rather than an interdiction on the vessel for deterrent reasons, and also noted that the vessel may not have even been heading to the US as Trump has claimed. It's also worth noting that the Venezuelan government has claimed that the video of the strike is an AI-generated deepfake, although the BBC says this claim lacks veracity. Today, I am joined by Professor Rob McLaughlin from the Australian National Centre for Oceans Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong, who is also a Commodore in the Royal Australian Navy Reserves, and Dr. Alonso Gurmendi Dunkelberg, who is an LSE Fellow in Human Rights. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we should say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I would also note that our guests are speaking in their personal capacity, and nothing they say can be attributed to their employers or clients. So, before we get down to business, our traditional first question, Rob, Alonso, what's your drink?
Nice to see you again, Tamsin. Hello, Alonso. Tonight, because it is night as we're recording, I'm actually having a hot chocolate.
Excellent. What have you got, Alonso?
Well, hi, Tamsin. It's nice to be here with Rob. I always a pleasure to be in this podcast. I'm holding my Stitch mug, Stitch the Disney character, and I am having a rooibos tea because it's 10 a.m. here.
Fantastic. Well, I'm also like Rob in Canberra and it's evening here, so I am joining you with rooibos. I have a blue brew rooibos, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's rooibos with dried blueberries, and it's delicious, and it's in my beautiful tea for one set that my partner got me when I got promoted to senior lecturer a while ago.
Congratulations again.
Thank you. Now, you've both been on the pod before, but not with me. So, Alonso, you and I first met through Twitter, may its digital soul rest in peace, and then through the Opinio Juris Pop Culture and International Law Symposium, then recording the D&D and International Law Session video for the 2024 Opinio Juris Pop Culture Symposium, and now we're collaborating on a couple of things together. How does our meeting and friendship look from your perspective?
So, I think you're the coolest person I know. That's how I can put it. I think I'm very lucky to have come across you and develop the friendship because in the beginning, where we were on Twitter, it was oh yeah, professional discussing things. We have research in common, but eventually I don't know how. It's one of those things you get really close to a person and then you don't really know how it happened. It just suddenly did. I think at one point we started nerding out on pop culture and stuff. And then I learned that you had been a chef and that you actually know how to weld swords and stuff like that. And that, you have come through such hardship in your life, and yet you are such a bright, happy, intense and fierce, but bright and happy person. And I'm this is an amazing, friendship that has developed. So to me, it looks like, I'm 39, right? So I'm already grown up, but the feeling that I get in my head when I think of you is oh, when I grow up, I want to be like Tamsin.
Thank you. That's really kind. I don't know how to respond to that except for the fact that I don't think of myself as cool. I think of myself as a weird nerd, but maybe that's part of the connection.
But that's the actual coolness. Which person who was actually the cool guy in school is actually now really cool as well? No, that's not how it works.
Fair enough. Rob, however, you and I first met about 14 years ago when I was still very young and in my 20s, late 20s, but still in my 20s, when I asked you to supervise my MPhil on the impact and application of law on maritime piracy, and you were able to see past my weird goth queer persona and the fact that my undergrad marks were like legitimately fucking terrible for good reasons, but legitimately fucking terrible because my project was cool and it had some good potential, and you could see that I had potential and there were reasons for my poor marks. We've been working together and have been friends ever since, and I still live in fear of disappointing you because you were my first mentor in academia. So, do you want to tell this story from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I'm very worried that I would give you any fear of disappointment, because you certainly can't do that. No, when you first walked through my door, I mean, you had me at pirate, so that was it. And it's been a joy ever since. I mean, we've worked on some really interesting things: pirates, undersea cables. Um, I will say, however, Tamsin, that the one thing, well, not the one thing, one of the things that you've in fact taught me in return is all about, something I never gave any credence to, which was methodology, which was just all bloody smoke and mirrors and ghost speak. But I actually have a 10% better understanding of that concept now, and that's all through, talking to you, reading your stuff, collaborating with you. So, we never stop learning, do we? So I guess that's my long way of saying, well, we're just colleagues, we're just friends, we're just comrades now, and it's a great pleasure to have good long-term comrades who you can talk to.
Oh, I would absolutely agree with that, and I'm really glad that I've been able to kind of, impart some insight into your work, because the learning hasn't just been one way. Although I'd say, even without necessarily realizing it, your work has always been fantastically, interdisciplinary with good methodology, even if that methodology was invisible in terms of your historiography as a legal historian. So I don't think you need to worry there. Maybe you've just learned how to articulate it better.
That's very true, very true. Thank you.
Yeah. So on to our main event, and this is a pretty significant incident. So on 3 September, the US military engaged in a lethal strike on what it is claiming was a drug boat on the high seas in the Caribbean. The US is justifying this on the basis of designating Latin American drug cartels as terrorist organizations. They're also justifying this on the basis of war on terror rhetoric, and maybe it's decades old war on drugs rhetoric, which maybe both of those are just war on ideas. I don't know. From a jus ad bellum perspective, is there any legal basis for this? And I'm going to note for our listeners that we discussed similar questions at a hypothetical level when there was potential proposals for unwilling and unable strikes in Mexico against cartels by the US. And at the hypothetical level, the call to the bar team kind of came pretty firmly on a no, but now we have an actual incident. So, Alonso, tell us about the jus ad bellum here.
I mean, where to begin? Because this is you mentioned that these first of all, let me say from the get-go, there is zero, none, absolutely nothing of legal justification for this strike. It is an arbitrary act in the high seas. It has no legal backing. A journalist wrote me a message what's the legal basis for this? And I responded, none. And that's it. That was my official quote. Please quote me on this. This is on the record. There's nothing that you can say for this to be legal. Even worse, to the fact that they didn't even check whether this was actually what they say they were, because chances are, if they killed 11 people, chances are this was actually a bunch of migrants. And I think it's very interesting when we start talking about the jus ad bellum, because I feel like even talking about the jus ad bellum means sort of legitimizing that argument that doesn't exist. You mentioned that the war on drugs, the war on terror, are war on ideas, and I think it's the other way around. They are ideas of war. They are frameworks that are meant to invent a war wherever possible, so that they can take advantage of legal standards that were not designed for these perspectives. And there's a long history of this. In in Mexico, they declared the cartels armed groups so that they could argue that there was an armed conflict in Mexico, so that they could militarize the conflict. In Peru and in all of South America, there are laws established there to like shoot down planes that are suspected of carrying drugs. To the point, like I guess in the airplane example of this in 2001. The United States, the CIA specifically, and the Peruvian Air Force killed a U.S. Christian missionary called Veronica Bowers and her 7-month-old daughter Charity because they confused their Cessna with a drug plane, and as a result of that strike, the United States stopped supporting shooting down planes because, of course, an American died. So. And it only restarted in 2023 with Trump. So I think it's important to state that from the get-go there is no there's no legal justification for this. Now, on the specifics of why there is no legal justification, because on the jus ad bellum, on the idea of war, on self-defense. Well, we first need to establish that self-defense operates, at least in the global majority opinion, operates between states. And there is simply no argument that this vessel was under the effective control of, or any kind of, or that it was acting on behalf of any kind of government. So on that regard, there is already no possibility for self-defense. Even if it were, the act of like trying to smuggle either drugs or people into another country is not an armed attack. It doesn't meet the threshold. It doesn't meet the nature of an armed attack. It doesn't even create enough of a threshold of harm for you to like even talk about an armed attack. And then if you start going into like unwilling or unable logics of thinking at the same time, then the unwilling or unable standard depends on this idea that the group that is being targeted, and I am no fan of this theory. I think it's not a good theory of law, but it rests on the idea that the group that you're targeting is actually threatening your country, at least in an abstract way. There is a military component to it. That doesn't happen when you're smuggling drugs or people into the country. That's just regular average crime that should be prosecuted, detained, and people sent to jail or deported and extradited. I don't know, but just not summarily executed, which is what's happened. And there's also then the law of war component, and like they would argue that it's the war on terror. So there's a law of war component, which is also ridiculous because the very idea of committing a crime means that you're not directly participating in hostility. So even in the absurd proposition that the United States was in an armed conflict with every single terror organization in the world, and that you can just appoint a smuggler a terrorist, kind of like the UK has done with a group whose name I can't say because I don't want to be thrown in jail. Even if you can appoint them terrorists, you still cannot just argue that in this case, this specific vessel was directly participating in hostilities because it was not engaging in any kind of, again, threshold of harm or with any direct nexus to any kind of conflict, should one such conflict exist, which it doesn't. So this is a preposterous situation where a government simply just said, this is going to look good in camera and we're going to get a good, propaganda out of this. And that's what they did. There's no legal basis for this.
Yeah, look, I don't think you'll get any argument from me. And just before I check if Rob has anything he wants to add to this, I will just say that my comment about war on ideas is exactly I meant exactly what you framed there, that this is just a preposterous set of ideas to create conditions that we're going to call a war. So that was poorly articulated by me in the moment, but you've articulated exactly what I meant there. And I would also say that unwilling or unable, I think most people would agree, except for maybe the US and Israel, is really just sparkling aggression as a doctrine.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to know we don't just agree on tea.
That's exactly right. We agree on the substance of the law as well through rigorous analysis. Rob, did you have anything you want to add on the IHL or jus ad bellum component?
I'd just say it's clearly not an IHL issue, as Alonso has said, because there's no armed conflict here. There's no IAC or no international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict at play here. And, that means, as we'll talk about in a minute, I guess, that the use of force and jurisdiction rules applicable in this situation are those that apply in maritime law enforcement, not in the law of armed conflict. I guess the only sidebar I'd note in the law of armed conflict, simply because it's fascinating and it brings us back to piracy. I would note, however, that just recently, in January actually of this year, the US Congress proposal was put to the US Congress to issue letters of marque for privateers to deal with drug vessels. I mean, this is a double no, really, because A, privateers only operate when it's an armed conflict, and as Alonso has explained, there is no armed conflict. And B, of course, privateering is outlawed at least since 1856, and even the US agreed in the early 1900s that privateering was outlawed. So, but it is still in the Constitution. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution about the Congress being able to issue letters of marque. But how that would apply in this situation is a little bit beyond me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go so far as a little bit bug nuts as an idea, but we can say that. And for our listeners who aren't familiar with this idea around why we're able to so definitively say that there is no armed conflict, we have very well established jurisprudence from the Tardich case in the ICTY that says definitively the existence or non-existence of an armed conflict is a question of fact. And then we can tie that to the ICJ jurisprudence in both Nicaragua and oil platforms around what constitutes an armed attack. And between the two of those, we can demonstrate at a factual level there is no need to even engage with this question for those who aren't familiar with these areas of law like we are. So moving then on to, as we've said, this question of maritime law enforcement, since we're able to say quite definitively there is no jus ad bellum or jus in bello justification or basis for the strike, even noting the very draconian US drug interdiction laws, and oh my goodness, if people want to know about how draconian and horrid they are, drop me an email. I've got a rant for you. Is there any, under international law, maritime law enforcement basis for the strike?
The short answer is no, and I'll start by just quoting something that a good friend of mine, and indeed a good friend of yours, Tamsin, Dr. Phil Drew, put up on Facebook yesterday about this. And he said, drug smugglers are criminals and should be treated as such. The mere act of a president labelling them terrorists does not make them a lawful target. These criminals are to be arrested, tried, and if found guilty, sentenced. That's in a nutshell the situation. So I guess to unpack it a bit, there's two issues, isn't there? There's jurisdiction and use of force. Now, in terms of jurisdiction, this is clearly not an Article 111 hot pursuit issue, and it's clearly not an Article 110 right of visit issue because, as we know, what the Law of the Sea Convention actually says about drugs in Article 108 is that states need to cooperate in the suppression of the traffic of illicit narcotics at sea. It doesn't say you can go and kill drug smugglers at sea. And it doesn't give you any special powers either to board or deal with vessels without flag state consent in that situation on the high seas. So this obligation then about how to deal with and cooperate in the suppression of illicit traffic of narcotics by sea is then given more sort of teeth, I guess you might say, or more detail really, in UNTOC, in the UN Convention on Transnational Organised Crime, and of course in the 1988 Vienna Drugs Convention, which you and I both know very well, Tamsin, from our time with UNODC, and especially Article 17, which relates to interceptions at sea. There's nothing in Article 17 that even remotely would authorise or be seen to operate as a cover for such conduct as we've seen in this situation. And then, to raise the issue that Alonso raised and you raised about terrorism, well, yeah, there is maritime law enforcement jurisdictions in relation to terrorism at sea. But even if a terrorism nexus was made out in this situation, it's not one that would be covered by any of the aspects in the 1988 Suppression of Unlawful Activities at Sea Convention, nor in the much less ratified 2005 protocol, which, by the way, was designed around terrorism. It's very specific to terrorism. And so there's certainly nothing in here that would allow an interdiction using lethal force in this manner. So I guess that brings us to the second bit, and that's the use of force element. Now, here, just to point out, this is a use of force we're talking about in maritime law enforcement terms. So it's different from the use of force that Alonso was talking about just before, which is, of course, the UN Charter type use ad bellum use of force issue. But nonetheless, the same answer applies. Is that no? This was, by the look of it, excessive. Why? Because parameters for the use of force in maritime law enforcement addictions are pretty well explained and very clearly explained in, amongst other things, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea MV Saiga #2 case, where Judge Ad hoc Anderson, as he was at the time, wrote in a separate opinion very clearly that, the use of force in maritime law enforcement, especially the higher end uses of force, only should come about after you've gone through the escalation, all the steps such as, warning shots, etc. And then the use of force at or into the vessel is only really a last resort. And then, when we do get to the point in maritime law enforcement of being able to shoot at or into the vessel, the purpose is disabling fire, direct disabling fire. It's to stop the vessel. But when you use direct disabling fire, you need to ensure that your aim point, is a place on the vessel where you won't injure or kill people. The cable locker, which is where the anchor cable is up the front, no one's there at sea. The rudder, the radar mast, places like that where there are not people at sea. So, this is not to say maritime law enforcement agents can't use lethal force. They can, but it's only in personal or individual self-defense, just like a police officer on the beat. So really, there is nothing in the law around maritime law enforcement that would permit this sort of proactive lethal targeting in this manner.
I would also add to that in this notion that, okay, there's no armed conflict, so what is the law that applies? Yes, there's maritime law enforcement, but also one thing that's been bugging me in all the all the articles that are popping up of people saying like, oh, this is the law applicable. Everyone sort of forgets that the United States is a member to the Declaration, the American Declaration on Human Rights, and that Venezuela is a member of the Convention, or the American Convention on Human Rights. And so therefore the Inter-American Human Rights system has jurisdiction over this, whether at the commission level, vis-a-vis the United States, or at the Inter-American Court level, in the context that this was a vessel that was, I think, a Venezuelan origin, flag, or whatever. So these individuals were subjected to the jurisdiction of a country that was within the Inter-American system. So the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Court, and the Inter-American Commission have interpreted these rules that we're discussing in very narrow terms. And so should this end up in the Inter-American Commission in a case against the United States, or in the Inter-American Court, the same kind of absolute necessity rules of saying you first need to attempt non-lethal options, and there's a very famous phrase by well, not a very famous. There's a way of thinking about this. Like a thief, you cannot kill a thief even if it means that they will manage to escape if what they have done is steal a wallet. It's the same principle, but with a boat. And that is something that the Inter-American Court has made very clear. They are very stringent on this. It's a court that has dealt with these kinds of crimes against drug smugglers over and over and over again. And so, yeah, it adds another level of illegality to all of this, because literally there is no single legal regime under which this is legal.
Now, Alonso, I'd just add, there is a... Oh, sorry, Tams, I was just going to say, there is an equivalent at sea, and that is we don't kill people for fish, It's the equivalent.
Yeah.
Oh, right. That's good to know. I didn't know that.
And the other one that's worth noting is that it would also be very much a violation of Article 6 of the ICCPR and the right to life, and to not be arbitrarily deprived of life.
Which is the equivalent in the American
is incorporated into the Inter-American system as well, but even broader beyond. Even if you could argue the Inter-American system didn't apply, the ICCPR still would, is all I was saying there. And for any of our listeners who are wondering why we're talking about UNCLOS when the US is not a ratifying member of UNCLOS, It's worth noting that 1988 Jackson Hole Statement between the US and the USSR recognized the customary authority of UNCLOS in all areas except for dealing with the area and the deep sea mining provisions. So that's why we can talk about UNCLOS even though the US is not a party.
I think another thing that's important to bring into this conversation is, as a Latin American who has basically grown up with the war on terror, everywhere I go, it is frustrating to, and by everywhere I go, I mean like I cannot travel through Miami with a Peruvian passport without being put in a little room because I might have cocaine in my bag, because like Peruvian traveling alone equals cocaine. So it is frustrating to me to see this specific act, this specific arbitrary killing explode into the forefront of academic discussion all over the world, when really it is the tip of a huge iceberg of things that have been happening in Latin America, not necessarily at sea, but always in the context of the US's war on drugs, and how the war on drugs and the war on terror have been merging in their logic. So when I was in like school, the worst thing you could say, well, even to this day, but like one of the worst things you could say was that IHL applies in Peru. It was seen as a betrayal. It was seen as a, how dare you suggest that the Shining Path, the MRTA, these groups that were engaged in violence against Peru had any kind of rights. And so the armed conflict paradigm was seen as traitorous, like treason. And then fast forward a few years, I've been called a terrorist for like saying that IHL applies, that there was an armed conflict in Peru. People in Peru get very mad at me. I'm the armed conflict guy, and no one likes me. And so fast forward a few years, and now the underlying logic of the government is the complete opposite. There is an armed conflict now, not 25 years when there was like a bomb every week in Peru, or where there was like I don't know, thousands of Shining Path operatives in the Andes going town to town killing people. No, now there's an armed conflict. Why? Mostly because the government discovered that it could use and manipulate the law of war to more easily kill people. And so now what we have in Peru is a few remnants of the Shining Path that are called the Militarized Communist Party of Peru, that are basically the bodyguards of drug smugglers, who then sometimes collaborate with and pay money to farmers, like small farmers, coca plant farmers, sometimes engage in more shady, like illegal behavior and force people into growing coca leaf. And so what the government does is comes in and says, oh, there's an armed conflict, right? So everyone that engages in this category called a narco-terrorist becomes a valid target. So the state will say every now and then, we just killed 20 narco-terrorists. And what does that mean? It probably means that they killed a bunch of like rural farmers that were growing coca leaves because they could not grow anything else in that area because there's no normal trade routes there. Maybe some criminals that were doing converting the coca leaves into cocaine, and then perhaps a member of an armed group that isn't even engaged in an armed conflict with the government, because I mean there's not enough violence. Like the Tadic standard that Tamsin was talking about isn't met. And so this has expanded all through the region. States that have armed groups like Peru, like Colombia, want to expand the law of war setting to every single part of the drug trade. Countries that don't, like Brazil and Mexico, they want to just argue that there is no other way but to shoot down planes that are carrying drugs or suspected of carrying drugs. And this is happening every day. Every single country in South America, I don't know in Latin America, but in South America, every single country has a law that is called the Ley de Derribo. The Ley de Derribo is the translation would be a shoot down law, which is a law that authorizes shooting down planes that are suspected of carrying drugs. And I mean, I've been writing about these for years. I've organized conferences in Latin America to bring people to talk about this, because I feel like yeah, this is a phenomenon that keeps growing and growing, and there's an unacknowledged feedback loop between what Latin American fascists do and what American fascists, Western fascists do. And not just on this, like half of what Trump now says about LGBT people are ideas that I was listening in Spanish 20 years ago. And so it's sort of frustrating to see this incident treated as an escalation. It's not really an escalation. It's just that the person that the entity that is doing it is relevant enough. And this is a facet of like the transformed war on terror. It's sort of like the United States has realized that if the United States bombs Iraq and drones Afghanistan and Pakistan, then yes, the media pays attention and sheds light into it. But if the US puts a drone base in Kenya, and then it's Kenya that operates the drone, and Kenya bombs Somalia, and Kenya, shoots Al-Shabaab pirates from the sea, then no one cares. And I feel it's the same phenomenon happening now with the war on drugs / war on terror, where you have El Salvador Bukele doing this exactly, saying that drug cartels are terrorists. You have Peru and Colombia saying that this is really armed conflicts, and so you have to extend the applicable rules of war to them, to civilians, basically, to criminals, but civilians. And you have countries that saying that, oh, self-defense authorizes us to shoot down Cessnas and little planes that carry drugs. And then all of a sudden, the boomerang turns around and, the US does it. And all of a sudden, everyone talks about how this is an escalation, something new, something weird, something we haven't done before. How could it get so bad? And it gets so bad because when it happens outside of the realm of the United States, no one cares. We are to the war of drugs. We in Latin America are what Kenya is to the war on terror. We are the proxies that make sure that these like abusive, arbitrary rules that kill people all the time are not discussed, are not engaged with. And I feel that what has happened with this specific incident is proof of that. People all of a sudden woke up one day and said, like, wait, what do you mean that a dingy boat with drugs or people we don't know was shot down? And I'm like, that happens. Where have you been for the past like 15 years? And it's incredibly frustrating as someone who comes from Latin America to see this, like just how much the war on drugs sort of like vanished from the minds of people when it's very real for millions of people not that far away from the United States.
Yeah, and it's not just that we're seeing these sorts of things in Latin America. If we just note that, earlier this year, former President Duterte of the Philippines was handed over to the ICC for this sort of conduct in the war on drugs within the Philippines. So it's a much broader phenomena, as you said, than just the US suddenly doing this. And even as you've noted, and I don't know if Rob, if you want to chime in on this a bit more, we've also seen, decades of extrajudicial killings via drones from bipartisan support for it within the US in the supposed war on terror, where the parameters of drone strikes were pretty sketchy. So I don't know if you want to have anything to add on that as an expert, Rob.
I guess I'd just add, this thing that you and Alonso are talking about is, it's the idea of accepting that there is some sort of armed conflict in train, which opens up, as you said, Alonso, these targeting rules, or opens up, as you said, Tamsin, the expansive approach to to UAV strikes and things like that. This is a worthwhile topic to talk about. Not only in Peru, but as you said, Alonso, Colombia for a while had parts in which the ROE for the rules of engagement with the forces were conflict based, and other parts of Colombia at the same time they were police based. The Philippines had a very similar thing. Where for part of the time when they were fighting certain groups in certain parts of the Philippines, it was considered to be armed conflict rules of engagement. In other parts, a similar group, but in a different part of the Philippines, it was considered to be a law enforcement approach, and that's a difficult attitudinal, but also quite an interesting legal approach to take. Not to say that it's wrong. In fact, it could be very, very sensible to take this sort of approach, but people have to call it what it is. And I think that's the key point that you're both making.
I actually feel like we've gone from accepting that armed conflict is a law to be feared because of how expansive and aggressive it can be, to armed conflict being a law that is interesting because it allows you to kill more people. And that's just a moral shift that is scary.
Yeah, and it's one that I would recommend if our listeners have kind of any interest on it. I know that both Gary Simpson and Ben Saul have written a lot on that grey zone creation between treating people as civilians and treating people as armed combatants, and how that's been manipulated to create these, as you say, terrifying, exploitable grey zones that exist. And so I said it's Gary Simpson and Ben Saul are the ones whose work I'm most familiar with on this, but there's a lot of work that's been done on it, and it's a really important area. And I would just note on what you're saying there, Rob, about sometimes it is sensible to have armed conflict rules of engagement in some parts of the country and not in others. In all of those situations, you'd still need to make sure that the Tardich standard of armed conflict being met at a factual level exists for that to be a lawful designation. I don't think I think that's a controversial statement, but it's worth remembering.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. It's been, it's a pretty heavy episode. People have, this is about how people are being killed. It's not a light episode. Do either of you kind of have anything else that you'd like to add on this incident or theme of incidents before we kind of move into our wrap up question, which is going to be a bit lighter?
No,
I think
that's fine from me.
Yeah, I think we've all expressed our anger at this. Very good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. Well, moving to our wrapping up question, which for season 2 is a bit different to season 1, but in all of them, we're asking a non-international law question about escape routes and reading and listening and things that are not international law, because we all need to be doing non-international law things. So, Rob, Alonso, I'd like to ask both of you, who is your favorite obscure or underrated character in fiction, and why do they speak to you?
So mine is a character from a series which only ever ran for one series, unfortunately. It was a great tragedy. It was a travesty, in fact, that it wasn't extended. But there was also a movie. The series was called Firefly and the movie was called Serenity. And the character is Jane. So Jane is a bloke and he's this unfiltered, sooky, but quite loyal sort of thug who's sort of pretty admirable at the same time. So I guess he's my sort of favourite obscure or underrated character.
Well, you cannot take the sky from me either. I'd just like to point out.
So my turn. I actually had a big problem with this question because I had so many things that I wanted to say. And like whenever someone asks me, what is your favorite whatever? Then an Excel sheet ensues, and that is not good for anyone. So so I decided not to do that. I'm not going to actually decide which one is my favorite obscure character because it might take us all day. So I decided to say, like, what would I want people to explore right now? And I think I have two themes that I really like that are nascent, not there yet, but sometimes Hollywood graces us with that. In that there's either the rebel is the good guy kind of material, which is so rare. Usually when you're in Hollywood, like there's a rebel and they always have to kill someone in cold blood so that you know that rebellion is bad. And that's one. So whenever you get a Hunger Games, for example, where the rebel is the good guy, Star Wars where the rebel is the good guy, that is something that I like. But then there's the other more recent trend that I guess like people my age are now finally getting to call some shots in studios from 90s kids. And society as the bad guy is like there's no one single evil person that is responsible for the problem, but it's actually prejudice or societal structures or oppression that is the bad guy. And on this regard, there's one character that I think everyone should explore that's called Nimona. Nimona is an animated movie that was released. It was originally supposed to be released by Blue Sky, which is the 20th Century Fox animation studio. But then Disney bought it, and Disney saw Nimona and said, oh, no, no, no. Oh, we're not publishing this, no, no, no. And tried to get rid of it. And so an independent studio called Annapurna sort of rescued it from the hole it was in, and ended it sending it up to Netflix, which at the time was just publishing anything you could give them. I don't think they really thought it through. So Nimona ended up being this like story where there's basically everything. There's disability representation, there's LGBT representation, there's like, but the main thing is the villain is defeated halfway through the movie. Like the individual villain is defeated halfway through the movie, and the real villain becomes the depression that society imposes on other people. In this case, in Nimona, the main character. So the villain that Nimona needs to overcome and is depression, and the only way to do that is for someone to like realize what is happening and go to her rescue by recognizing that their own prejudices about who Nimona is or isn't are wrong. Acknowledge that and apologize. And I just think that's just very powerful, considering that many of the problems that we have now as a society are like that, are structural. It's no few bad apples. It's a system that is brutal, inhumane, horrible, and oppresses everyone. And so that's why I think people should go check out Nimona. It's on Netflix. It's really great, and I really love it. It's not necessarily my favorite obscure character, but I think it's a character that more people should know. And I did tell you that I thought too much about this.
No, that's really good. I've never heard of it, so I'm definitely going to have to go check it out. But I think that brings us to the end of our episode. So thank you both for joining me to talk about these things, and to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.